Kind of left off talking last time about what do you do to manage forest and outdoor recreation resources, specifically vegetation resources, in the presence of human beings who are trying to, in some cases, kind of run all over the place and in a lot of cases trample that vegetation. We saw some examples of graffiti on that vegetation from the last two class sessions. It's a lot to try and keep your forests and glades and meadows and grasslands and shallow rooting shore species like rushes, cattails, that sort of thing, horsetails. It's a lot to keep those alive because recreation in its many forms brings us right into contact with a lot of those, and in some cases, like with mature trees in a campsite like we saw last week, part of the recreation activity is just kind of hanging around the campsite and doing stuff. And if you got a tree right there and a hatchet in your hand, well, it'd be a shame to carry all that weight of a hatchet in your backpack or from the parking lot like 20 meters away in a developed campground and not use it, right? So that's kind of the low-grade thinking that some folks use that ends them up, in some cases, committing serious federal crimes. There was an example of a climber out in California who, I think it was in California, maybe in Joshua Tree, can't remember, who was cleaning famous ancient trees out of climbing routes because he thought they were just kind of annoying. Like, trees, as you know, can grow out of cracks and crevices in cliff faces, and some of those big vertical cracks are lots of fun for rock climbing. And so this fellow cut down a tree that John Muir, you may have heard that name before, was fairly famous for having personally referenced and enjoyed that tree specifically. This guy cut it down. So that's bad. That's a permanent impairment. That's beyond impact, which is mostly what we're talking about, right? Things that can heal back over time or be revegetated or something like that. But when people start to kill off the general Sherman, right, the largest tree in the world, or by height, or start to kill off iconic individual trees, there's just no replacing those unique and very, very valuable and precious and beloved and historic in a lot of cases resources. So let's talk a little bit more about managing. How do we prevent? How do we mitigate when it does happen? What we can't prevent? How do we repair when damage has spilled over beyond what natural resistance or resilience can do? So we were talking about, we kind of left off talking about selecting ground cover. That is, you can plant brambles, thorny species that are whippy like rubus, at the edge of a trail, right across a visitor-created trailhead to stop people from going on that trail, and let that just kind of grow if it's a native species, so that you don't have to maintain a fence and repair a fence, and later when things are healed up, pull the fence out, right? That's multiple waves of maintenance costs that would be nice to spend kind of on anything more productive than repair work. So let nature do some of the work for you. It's entirely okay to do greenscaping instead of hardscaping when you are trying to kind of shape or mold human behavior around vegetation. Okay, so this is where we believe where we left off last time. This is a picture of a field form for a lichen impact study, a cliff face plant community survey that we did at Sino Canal National Historic Park, specifically in the Potomac Gorge section. The Potomac River runs through Washington, D.C. and kind of cuts off the west and south corner of that diamond shape. It's beautiful sort of 80-foot cliffs, but it's a highly channelized river, so when there's any kind of flooding pressure, it goes up because it can't go sideways, and it goes up 80 feet sometimes before it can spread sideways. So highly channelized system. You can imagine that the rock climbing when the water's down is pretty amazing, right? I mean, 80-foot cliffs, and there's miles and miles of them, and there are millions of people living right there, so there's lots and lots of pressure, lots of demand. And that's kind of the best and only supply. You've heard of politicians talking about draining the swamp, right? Washington, D.C. was built out of a filled-in swamp, partially. It is right down and coastal, so there's not a lot of vertical rock spaces, and the Potomac Gorge Cliffs are kind of it. So lots and lots of pressure, lots of demand, just many, many people. Even if it's a low percentage of the people who want to go rock climbing, they sure can. And the political dynamics of that particular city mean there are a lot of young people who come in to work on whichever side has won the most recent election, and then they work their butts off and they go blow off steam doing rock climbing or hiking along the nearby Billy Goat Trail or the C&O Canal towpath and so forth. So lots and lots of vegetation trampling pressure. So this form is basically just a simple catalog of how's the lichen doing. Again, lichen are not specifically vegetative. It is an entire ecosystem or community unto itself, each little patch of it growing on a rock face. But rock climbers come into contact with that in very specific and demanding of the lichen ways. And so we need to keep tabs on this stuff. You can't manage something if you can't measure it. You guys may have seen that saying stapled to Dr. Ruffner's door, right? If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So this is part of how we do this stuff. And our hazard tree exercise later on this afternoon is a direct adaptation of this kind of thinking. We're just going to get out there and measure and map out, is everything kind of fine with these cliff edge communities? Or within arm's reach, about one full wingspan, so about 5 feet on either side of any of the big cracks or well-known pitches with lots of sport bolted anchors on site that visitors have drilled in over time. Within that about 10-foot swath, you can think of that as like a vertical trail. So can we find evidence of impacts? And maybe we find some impacts. Like maybe we find where some climbers over time have splashed a bunch of bleach or used metal wire bristle brushes to clean that stuff off to make their tiny little finger pad handholds or big juggy handholds more functional or a little bit cleaner at the expense of pulling out or extirpating that vegetation locally. And maybe we don't find any of that. Maybe everybody's playing real nice. Maybe the flood events kind of wipe away all evidence of impact and reseed aggressively those little niches and stuff like that. So we just don't know until we get out there and look. So this is an intensive thing. It's on harness. You're basically doing rock climbing. You're top roping and rappelling down from the bottom, down from the top, throwing up a quadrat on a vertical surface instead of tossing your PVC, 1 meter square, whatever it is, down on the ground, and doing a lot of the same ecological assessment, cover, species type, evidence of impacts. You can see what's going on, that we do horizontally flat on the ground. We just adapt it for recreation purposes to be vertical. Michael.
Does chalk have any, I know climbers use chalk when they're climbing. Does that have any negative effects on rock or plant life?
It can. Chalk is extremely water insoluble, calcium carbonate, and it is highly chemically reactive, if you want to think of it that way. So, are you familiar with the White Cliffs of Dover? It's a place over in Great Britain.
I think I've seen pictures of it.
Yeah, it's a famous landmark. It's basically a sea cliff, and chalk. This is chalk as we have it here in the classroom. The mineral that this is based on is called talc, and it is one of the softest minerals, right? It is softer than your fingernail, the keratinous material that fingernails, hooves, animal claws, or talons are made out of. Very, very soft. And yet, it can be a sea cliff with waves hitting it and stuff like that, and they're not completely gone after many, 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 many years, thousands, tens of thousands of years of wave action on them, because they're deeply insoluble in water. So all that to say, when you have a rain-limited system like a big sheltered overhang and particular mineral substrates that people are climbing on that don't buffer acid-base reactions, calcium carbonate is what you eat when you got a little bit too much acid in your stomach. And it bubbles off some gases, forms some water, and neutralizes that acid. So it's highly chemically reactive and changes stuff like soil pH where it is introduced. And in these tiny little pockets of soil, right, you might have 1/10 of a cubic centimeter of volume of soil in a tiny little, crack or crevice on the cliff face. So when that gets splattered with calcium carbonate, chalk, or magnesium carbonate, they're blends of it for rock climbing. It's not necessarily just pure calcium carbonate. That can absolutely destroy chemically the fertility of that tiny little soil supply in that spot. So to the extent that there's an overlap of like rare or very fragile vegetation, like on the Shawnee, the concern was it's a whole bunch of tiny little pockets of vegetation that you can't find anywhere else in the southern Midwest. You can't find it anywhere else in the Midwest because this stuff is native to kind of central Canada and was left here when the glaciers came down and stopped most recently right along where the line of 13, Highway 13 goes. And then the cliffs just south of that had really cold, like central or northern Canadian weather back when the glaciers reached this far. So the glaciers retreat, leave those plants kind of stranded behind because they can't migrate back north as things warm up and dry out. So they're super rare here. You can have like state endangered plants and animals versus federally endangered ones. The stuff that's on the Shawnee, to my knowledge, is not federally endangered, but it's just impossible to find anywhere else in the state. So the Shawnee National Forest has to, or the management team there has to protect those spots from climbing impacts like chalk or cleaning very aggressively. I mean, they're super weirded out by it because that is like the law. And the climbers aren't necessarily out to break the law for the sake of breaking the law, but sometimes they do because they disagree with some of the management decisions on the Shawnee or anywhere else. So yeah, the answer is the chalk can, in kind of edge cases, this isn't a super common thing. I mean, it's safe to touch chalk, it's safe to eat it, but maybe don't eat a lot of chalk. Give yourself some pretty nasty kidney stones, I'm sure. But it can be a thing, right? We're altering sites for recreation purposes to improve their recreation quality, not necessarily their habitat quality when we show up to develop a route. And sometimes the change is pretty subtle. The other way that chalk is an impact isn't really a vegetation impact, but it is more of a human experiential or opportunity resource one. Most climbing chalk is white, right? It's bright white. And that on any kind of rock face other than bright white rock faces, which are not really that common, you can see kind of the track of the climb. So when we were at Zion National Park this past summer, and at several spots many spots along the canyon, if you looked up and you looked really closely, you could see chalk, kind of zigzagging its way up a particular pitch on, that's big crack wall climbing over there in a lot of sandstone. And it's amazing. That's world-class rock climbing. Like to climb over the Virgin River, hanging out 1,500 feet over the valley floor, and you still got several hundred feet left to go on a big pitch climb. Like, that's awesome. But the Park Service has taken a very hard stance on saying you have to buy specially color-matched chalk locally that's mixed in with powdered sandstone of the exact same color as what you'll be climbing on. So it's functionally invisible. And what that does is it kind of stops casual climbers from seeing something that they hadn't thought about before and going, oh, I could totally send that. For those of you listening at home, send is climber jargon for do it. And it removes that releaser cue for somebody who maybe doesn't have the higher specialized awareness of, I gotta use color matched chalk so that I don't harm the aesthetics, so that I don't invite somebody accidentally who knows less than I do to do the same thing and leave a whole bunch of white chalk. So they can be kind of an aesthetic thing, a behavioral trigger or cue thing. It can be a vegetation, it can be a soil chemistry thing. And this all only matters because, like, if we dropped a piece of chalk on a hiking trail that's horizontal in the Shawnee, and we ground it to dust, and we walked all over it in the middle of the trail and left a little white spot on the trail, nobody cares. But on a cliff face, the ecological considerations are much, much more tightly constrained. There's a much more tiny space or envelope within which these different cliff pocket plant species can survive, you know? So that's kind of why it's intensified in a vertical sense versus a horizontal sense. It could be the exact same bedrock type that you're walking across instead of climbing on, and so forth, but just the angle of it changes or moderates that severity of the impact quite a bit. So, long answer to your question about chalk. Any other questions about recreation uses relative to wildlife? No, not wildlife, vegetation. Sorry, I was working on the wildlife slides today. All right, let's continue on. So, we're gonna capture stuff kind of like this. Now, this is the data sheet for that cliffside study. So, you know, when we're going out to look for hazard trees relative to recreation sites like campsites or picnic areas, we don't really care about the ground slope angle because we're generally camping and picnicking in relatively flat spots, so it doesn't really matter, right? We can measure a lot of stuff, but if it's not helping us answer the question and get some work done, then we're just not going to worry about it. So this is the difference between science or research versus management. As a scientist, I want to know all about everything. What is the specific insolation? What's the albedo, the irradiance, reflectance of sunlight at this spot, and so forth? What is the slope angle? What is the facing? What is the azimuth of this particular, in this case, cliff face or campsite slope or whatever, down to the 10th of the degree? As a manager, I don't care about any of that stuff. I'm just trying to figure out, for hazard trees, which trees, if they fall, are going to kill my visitors. And all the other trees, don't care. Let them fall. Okay? That's going to be some pretty awesome habitat over time. So, we want to always keep in mind here that this particular set of discussions is based on the management needs and perspective. If you're looking for a more detailed and crunchy understanding of the more intensive ecosystem dynamics and human dynamics, let's have some conversations about that. We generally have those conversations more at a grad school level. So if that's something that really scratches the itch for you, let's have a conversation about grad school. If it is not, don't worry. This is good to go for the management side of stuff, okay? So here, this is a short video of how trampling can happen here at SIU. And this is instructive because this is out in front of the library, by the way. We've got hardened infrastructure, concrete sidewalks that are ADA compliant, that get you efficiently where you need to go, and so forth. But there is a human use consideration that causes this particular trampling impact. So, watch this again. And obviously the impact here is trampling pressure on the vegetation of the grass. Pretty straightforward. But the less straightforward question is, why? Why is there trampling impact? We've already spent tens of thousands of dollars, concrete is expensive, tens of thousands of dollars to get these nice new ADA compliant sidewalks, Americans with Disabilities Act, compliant. Why is this a problem? Why are we dealing with this? We've solved this problem, haven't we? Clearly we haven't. What's going on?
Run first bike with that many people on the sidewalk.
Yeah, this is a crowding issue, okay? So a researcher who thinks in the abstract is going to say, okay, this is inefficient uptake or utilization of the sidewalk. The sidewalks are very busy at what time each hour? What time? does each sidewalk get super busy all across campus? 10 till, exactly. And then by about 3 to 4 after, they're pretty quiet. You know, there's still people walking around, but not nearly like what you're seeing here. So, a researcher is going to say, okay, we need to spread out or reallocate the use a little bit. The application on a trail being issue people permits to not all show up at the trailhead right after breakfast, ready to go on their hike. Have some people stagger start, like you get a permit for 8 or 8:05 or 8:10 or 8:15 or 8:20 on down through the day until you've got all of the use evenly spread out and you don't have this peak or flood of people at specific times. Now, obviously that's an absurd example. We're not going to issue permits to people to walk on the sidewalk at specific times on campus. That's the wrong application. But what can we do? We have a different use scenario here, but a very common one. And this kind of scenario is repeated at the trails and sidewalks and road margins and for a few idiots in the middle of the road, right after breakfast, right before lunch, right after lunch, and right before dinner at most major popular national parks. So what could we do with this? We have somebody trampling our resource in a developed environment where the use pressure is very high. And the answer to this question is any one of many. So, what could we do here? Mike?
Some places on campus, like in East Campus, they have the bike lane, the walking lane, and then they also do the winding sidewalks as well.
Yeah, okay. So part of the issue here is that all the walkers aren't really crowding each other as they're all moving the same speed. The bicycle moving at a heterogeneous speed is going to encounter every single one of those people or groups of people as they try to use the same facility. So sometimes the answer is to, according to our 4 big strategies, increase supply of the resource. Increase supply. And paving an extra bike lane is increasing in real terms. There are more square feet of pavement, and the bikes have maybe a separated or right next to lane, sharrows. Narrow and sharrows. We could increase the supply in effective terms. That is, maybe put a bright yellow stripe down the middle of each of these sidewalks and put a bike icon on one side and a pedestrian icon on the other side. And as long as everybody's following those symbols, you could still increase the density of people on the sidewalk a little bit. If you've ever been to like a baseball game or basketball game, people will fill up crowded walkways almost to the point of jostling each other in order to get where they need to go, and it works okay, and there's potentially shared space for the bicycles to move at a different speed on the same facility. Alright, so a strip of paint is a lot cheaper than paving hundreds or thousands of extra square feet of sidewalk, but maybe it doesn't solve the problem quite so well. Alright, so that's one of our 4 strategies, increase supply. We could instead harden the resource versus impacts. We can make the grass resistant to impact somehow. Or we could make the grass more resilient somehow. And the idea is on making the grass more resistant to bike trampling and then allowing bikes to go across it because it's more resistant is the inference there. And we make grass more resilient from impacts, able to spring back better. Any ideas? ripped out all of his grass. Just skip one. And we went real hard with AstroTurf. Turf! It works on sports fields. It could work here. It'd be expensive and dumb and require like replacement every X years. But we could fix it. And that would absolutely increase the resistance of the area, not the resource for pulling out all the resource, for pulling all the grass, to do that. We could increase the grass's resilience by fertilizing the bejesus out of it and making sure that we stop short of burning the soil chemically with those fertilizer additives. But we've all seen vigorously growing, freshly fertilized grass, right? Okay, that's a thing. When I went to college in South Carolina at a beautifully, beautifully manicured school named Furman University as an undergrad, one thing that they would do, because it's South Carolina and it gets real hot and it gets real dry in late summer into autumn, they would spray paint the grass green. Because that's what we do in the genteel South when your grass isn't quite green enough. This would look good on the postcards, okay? They would literally spray the grass green. Now, this is a common technique down south because soil nutrient loading is extremely poor already. And so they just mix in a whole bunch of very, very strong green dye. They're like painting a brown soil green as well. And mix that in with the fertilizer and try to sort of artificially prop up these beautiful lawns in soils that are palynitic ultrasols. It's the same nutrient-depleted soil as in the Amazon basin, just absolutely no nutrients in it. Okay? So we can artificially or synthetically increase the resistance or the resilience of the resource in this case. We could also modify visitor behavior. We do this directly by putting up a fence around each one of these sections of grass. Some campuses do that. And you are walking in lanes, cattle chutes, from point to point everywhere because they spend a lot of money on making that grass look good for some reason. And this is America in 2023 and green lawns are really important, I guess. So, we can modify use directly. We could have campus police sitting out there writing tickets to everybody and like comically chasing after them, like being like, "Wait, you have an infraction, sir, please stop." We could directly modify visitor behaviors. More commonly, though, more friendly approach is to indirectly modify use by helping people understand the consequences of their actions. So this is information and or education. And then visitors get to make the choice of, okay, now that I know that my bike is going to kill this grass, I'm going to ride on the sidewalk, or I'm going to ride cautiously in traffic on the road, which in Carbondale is strictly the legal option. You get the same ticket for riding your bike on the sidewalks in Carbondale City as you would for driving your car on the sidewalks as a motor vehicle. Yeah. So it's not a great situation, right? There's compromises to be had. There are real safety considerations in these decisions. So when you force behavior change with fences or with tickets or citations, stuff like that, the compliance rate very high. Satisfaction among visitors really pretty low. They're unhappy with getting tickets in beautiful natural places like the national park. Okay? Indirect is much, much more friendly. It's like, hey, did you know that this grass can only handle XYZ trampling pressure? And that's why we hope that all of our students and faculty and staff decide to, on their own, go across campus using paved surfaces, traveling and camping on durable surfaces. Is going to camp on campus, right? Okay, so we modify use directly or indirectly. Or finally, our fourth and final option is to limit use. It's our fourth big strategy. Okay? So, direct versus indirect human behavior modification. Part of that is in time, Part of it is in space, part of it is in activity, part of it is in managerial options. What options are you giving to the visitors to do? We could get everybody off the grass by paying for a huge and aggressive shuttle bus system around campus. We could call it the Saluki Express. And if a bus was pulling up to 50 or 60 different stops across campus, to pick some large number, every 45 seconds, then you wouldn't have to use sidewalks much at all, right? Jump on in the air conditioning, free Wi-Fi on the buses, free for the cost of tuition, right? And get from point A almost all the way to point B, short sidewalk up from the drop-off point to the building, but it takes all this pressure off. That's a managerial option, okay? So we can modify visitors' behaviors directly or indirectly. Now, it's not always wrong. Oh yeah, sorry.
So you can also ignore it, but if that's the only guy who does it, he only does it twice a week. Is he really?
Yes, exactly. So that's a valid point. If in your data collection, we saw a cliff edge data collection form earlier, if in your data collection, instead of just an anecdotal video showing this one guy going through, maybe that's the only guy that does that all day long. And the grass is already resistant to that. So you have non-representative data, an anecdote, not like full spatial sampling and survey across time and all of this, like closed circuit camera or something. And maybe your monitoring over time shows you that the grass is honestly fine. Like there was no path where he was. All right, so maybe we don't have a problem. Maybe the use level there, the pressure, the trampling pressure is just already low enough. And we already have solved the problem with the sidewalks. Okay, so valid point. Cool. At the other end, sometimes you just can't get enough people, especially in a, so we were right here, Gary, over the summer. This is where we saw that telescope set up at Grand Canyon to see the moon, and there's an astronomer in this building here, just further up at the far end of this, giving a talk that night. Like this low, bare iron post and chain fence is, it's kind of industrial. Like that's not a natural vibe, but they purposely got that and acid treated that metal surface, not with a dirt colored paint, but to kind of naturally weather a little bit, so there's some variation on the chain links, on the posts and stuff like that, and it's kind of close-ish to the mineral soil that these are planted down below this topsoil, right? So at places like the Grand Canyon, 2, 3, 4, 5 million visitors a year, right? It's not like out in front of Morris Library, where maybe it's one guy all day riding his bike across in one spot, and whoever does it tomorrow is going to ride across in maybe a slightly different spot and not even hit any of the same grass twice. Here, there's millions of people. This is one of the spots where visitors are intentionally focused onto, because this whole area is hardened up, and they've got basically patches of vegetation all throughout that hardscape, that impermeable landscape design, so that there's something to manage rainwater and snowmelt runoff, so that it's not a big concrete-y mess. Okay. And in that case, where the use is very, very high, and the incentive to get directly from spot A to spot B is high enough to get from like this visitor center building and auditorium over to some bathrooms on the far side. Like if all of a sudden you get rumbly and you're tumbly and you gotta make it over there, you gotta have a fence to encourage that person who, to solve a temporary problem, they create a near permanent impact, right? So that diarrhea is gonna be gone in 36 hours, but their trampling effects will last for years in a arid 7,500 foot elevation desert plateau like this, or semi-arid plateau. So sometimes fences are okay, right? We don't want to vilify that. It is an effective and appropriate thing in a lot of places. Okay, so let's kind of wrap up with this, we'll do, I don't know, 10 or so more slides, and then we'll jump into our hazard tree assessment, okay? So put a pin in this, and what we are doing is directly modeled off of hazard tree removal and trimming exercises at national parks. So this is also at Grand Canyon, but from several years ago, where a concession organization, Xanterra, that runs a bunch of the lodges and cafeterias and stuff, like we had overpriced pizzas and stuff at Xanterra restaurants at the Grand Canyon this summer. They do a bunch of facility management as well, and in this case they had a whole bunch of trees flagged for removal. These were just some older pines that just were struggling with a whole bunch of blacktop nearby over the years versus their root structures and so forth. And so it's okay. Like, they're going to come in behind these removals and stake out and plant some saplings and be good to go and keep the overall thing working about right in terms of ecological function and that aesthetic. Okay? So there's a lot of urban tree care out in wild places. And by urban tree care, I mean individual tree work, right? So up in specific trees, hazard trees, ornamental native trees that have to be taken care of in functionally urban settings like Grand Canyon, South Rim Village. So don't think that urban forestry is only for Chicago and St. Louis and Carbondale. Funny story at the Apple Festival, I ran into one of our students, Tyler, who graduated several years ago. He is now just about to get his arborist certification and is doing exactly this stuff for our fair city. So, a couple of hazard tree removal anti-patterns, things we don't do, right? This is a forestry program. We're going to do the real thing the right way for the right reasons, on the right schedule, using the right protective equipment, and so forth. Okay. Otherwise, we're going to deal with stuff like this. Because the United States National Park Service is a preservation-oriented organization, the assumption here is that they're going to do everything to the highest standard for the right reasons in the right time to the absolute limit best of their capability, not just kind of cowboy their way through stuff. Okay? So, there's lots of examples of tree care gone wrong. Okay, let's see, just to finish off these last couple of slides here, and then we'll head outside. For our field data techniques like hazard tree assessment and removal, like measuring campsites for erosion and tree damage like we saw in the impacts section last week, and so forth, we want to answer a very, very important question of what's the timing, what's the time slice or interval that we need to get after this work with. And in campsites for the National Park Service, that interval is typically 3 to 5 years. And this is for backcountry campsites. For front country campsites, it's every season. So when we go to Mammoth Cave or Ozark Scenic Riverways, somebody in resource management in that branch of the Park Service has gotten their eyes on the trees that you're sleeping under in that developed campground within the last year, and rechecking these every year, because where use is high, the risk exposure is high. Most nights, those campsites are going to be filled with living and very squishy human bodies. So if there's a hazard tree within killing radius of that campsite, we need to know about that. Okay? But for other resources in other places, we don't have to measure it all the time every season. Like once every 5 years for some backcountry sites is plenty enough if it's on relatively stable soil. If 5 years ago the last survey suggested it was actually kind of fine, and the last couple of surveys of it were kind of fine, and you're graphing what's the total exposed soil area of this backcountry campsite, is it growing? Is it kind of revegetating, shrinking back down? Are people not even using it enough to keep it open? Right? It's a very simple graph. Square feet, square meters versus time. So first time you measure it, 5 years in, 10 years in, 15, and so forth. And we have, let's say, a 10 by 10 site, 100 square feet. And that's how big it was at year 5. It was at 75 square feet before, 10 feet by 7.5. And so there was some concern that this site is trending upward, people are using it more and so forth, so maybe we send out a crew at year 6 to do a little bit of site ruination, discourage people from using it so much, and the site holds stable, and then it starts dropping back down. We saw last week that recovery is typically slower than impact, so shallower, flatter slope on recovery versus on growth. But the top of this graph here is 100 square feet. That's not very big for a campsite. Some big campsites on the George Washington Jefferson National Forests, kind of by Shenandoah National Park out east, if you're familiar with that area. Some of these are like thousands of square feet. It's multiple campsites that have grown together so there's not even any separation between them anymore. And they're just trashed. And they keep getting bigger too. So in that case, that's like a couple of 100 feet wide, maybe 40, 50 feet deep. It's a big destroyed area. And it's an obvious big destroyed area, typically right next to a road, like a forest road. Okay? The campsites where people aren't going to have a quiet contemplation of solitude in their place in the vast eternity, they are, trucking in coolers full of beer and spilling a whole bunch of airsoft pellets on the ground and leaving them there for some reason. Anyway, so we're looking at what's the trend, but also what's our absolute scale here. Are we down in the 100 or less square feet? Or are we up in the thousands or tens of thousands of square feet for some of the worst? Okay, so for veg management best practices, let's close and rehab access to the sensitive or critical areas. We'll educate visitors about impacts where we have to do a closure in a place where people are thinking about going. We have to explain why. Okay? So, in the visitor center, at the front gate, in the information pamphlet at the campsite or campground, let people know, hey, vegetation loss, habitat loss is a real problem around here, so just please, walk on the road when you are walking from your campsite over to the bathhouse or something like that, okay? Removing invasives, doing site restoration is extremely intensive work. When we saw those videos at Haleakala National Park talking about non-native invasive grass removal inside the Crater Wilderness area, they've been doing that for decades because it's hand pulling work. It's called stoop labor, right? You're pulling out one tuft of grass at a time. You straighten up, walk to the next one, pull that one out, flip it over, let the roots dry out, and it dies. And you have to do that before it seeds out each season. Okay, so there's a timing restriction as well. So this is a thing. You got to do this in areas that you are trying to preserve and bring back to whatever definition of natural your park ecology team has settled on, like pre-Columbian, pre-1492, or whatever. But understand that you're chaining yourself to a pretty long, expensive, laborious process. Also, letting folks understand, hey, you are required to use our fancy boat washing station at the ramp to keep everything that's here, and nowhere else. If you'd like to do XYZ fishing, this is why, for example. You would explain that on the sign, okay? You would also use hostile revegetation design on purpose. Planting thorns sounds like a super mean thing to do, but it's actually very kind to the other 99% of the habitat that is not trail. And you got to keep that in mind when you are tallying up the positives versus the negatives, right? We always want to concentrate all but the most diffuse, low use rates spread out a few people across millions of acres. Everything else gets concentrated on trails. Everything else gets concentrated on bedrock. Everything else gets concentrated on road surfaces, okay? It's not wrong to pave a road through a natural area if you can keep everybody on that road. the entire rest of the space is good to go, assuming that that road isn't carving up habitat and causing fragmentation. We'll talk about that in a little wildlife section. Okay? We can inform and educate visitors, modifying use indirectly, and you have to do that when you are closing something and people can see the closure. If they see a fence across an informal trail that you're trying to close, like we were saying last week, they'll go around it on the left side and they'll go around it on the right side. Now you have 3 sections to repair. This was a hard lesson we learned doing research and work, restoration work with Steve Baer at Shenandoah National Park. There's a lot of side trails away from Skyline Drive, which goes along the Shenandoah Ridgeline for 70, 80 miles. And for every side ridge, there's like a pull-off where somebody has just pulled off their vehicle and just walked out on that shoulder slope because it's beautiful. And every one of those has a trail on it. So in trying to close all those down, they found that if they just put up a fence, they have tripled the impact, at least in that first section of the trail, to get around that fence. But where you have acute plant injury like graffiti and stuff like that, that pushes you over into interdiction immediately. There's no sign that's going to stop somebody who's ready to do something like that. So in that case, it's more of an interdiction issue. This actually looks like this combination of techniques. So this is a photo at Isle Royale National Park, where we took summer camp in 2012, 11 years ago. Oh my God, I can't believe that was 11 years ago. It's a, 7 by 3 mile long island up in Lake Superior. It's a 6-hour ferry ride from Upper Peninsula, Michigan. It's a couple of miles south of the Canadian side of Lake Superior, which is a very big, very deep, very stormy lake. If you're familiar with the old story about the song about the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, that's right here. It's like 2 miles from right here, off the coast of this island. This is a crazy storm-racked place. This is a very copper-rich island, and so lightning strikes hit it constantly. And the Native Americans thought it was kind of their version of Mount Olympus. They thought the gods were on this island because lightning strikes, bam, 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 every storm that rolled through. Anyway, so the way that the National Park Service manages wilderness plant protection on Isle Royale, because basically the entire island is just one big wilderness island, is this. There's a series of kind of parallel ridges that define this island, and you can kind of hop from section of bedrock to section of bedrock up on these ridges, and then down in the hollers in between each one of these parallel ridge lines, you sort of drop down into kind of wet, boggy valleys, and there are short sections of like soil surface or surface trails there to connect you to string together these much longer and fun to hike along segments of bedrock. So traveling and camping on durable surfaces, allowing unpleasant vegetation to grow right at the trail's edge and not pulling that stuff out, but leaving it there on purpose to act as sort of a natural, vibrant green, thorny fence that doesn't look like built structures. Okay? Pretty cool stuff. It's a wonderful, wonderful place if you've never been. Check it out. Here it is at Great Smoky Mountains National Park at Klingman's Dome. Anybody ever been? Highest point in the Appalachians, or Appalachians, depending on if you're a Yankee or not. And this is a shot taken from the dome. This stuff here is just sort of burlap netting. It's called jute netting. And so what you do is you roll this stuff out on freshly placed soil, like if you're doing regrading or site revegetation, something like that, and you had to rip out a whole bunch of stuff. You roll that out. This is like a very, very fancy, heavy-duty, longer-lasting version of putting out hay or straw, typically, when you're reseeding, so that birds don't get all of the grass seed or whatever other seed you're spreading. And it also acts as a rain kinetic energy or rain impact shield to absorb or ablate that energy and let the water directly infiltrate down. So this is like a bandage for a newly revegetated area. It's a bandage that can be hundreds of meters long. Okay? So that is a couple of examples of just some of these different tactics that we've been talking about at some of these actual national parks. Okay, so this is the real thing. All right, let's get back to our hazard tree work and take a look at this. So this is a very long 14 pages, but don't worry, it's not actually, I don't think. I don't know professors are dumb and weird anyway, so who knows? We'll see. Yeah. Again, this can be a team effort if you guys would like. I don't mind. Just the last page has some questions that I'd like each person to kind of tackle on your own. Just kind of synthesize what you learn. All right, so this gives you a little bit of an objective and then some background information, sort of just explaining, hey, if there are trees near campsites and picnic areas, and there are people in those campsites or picnic areas, and occasionally trees fall down, then we have to do just a little bit of, even if it's wildly inaccurate, back of the envelope math on what is our risk exposure, meaning how likely is this to happen? How often does a tree fall in the woods? And then our risk severity, which is if a tree falls in the wood and it happens to hit somebody, or it happens to crush a bathhouse or punch a hole in the roof of our visitor center, what are we looking at for repairs? What are we looking at for legal liability? What do we have to probably pay out to the family of the deceased? Okay? Here's the thing. If somebody's hiking in the woods and a tree falls on them, that's just bad luck. But the moment that you put a campsite in, or a visitor center, or a picnic shelter, or something like that, you are representing to your guests, your visitors, that this is a safe and intended thing for you to do in a safe and intended place that we have provided and a facility in that place for you to do it. So at that point, you are responsible if you are the park or the ranger or what have you. Okay? So we have this idea in park and wildlife management called feasance, which is, you could translate that Latin 10-cent word into just responsibility. So you have things like feasibility studies. Is something possible, and is it the most responsible and right thing for us to do? A feasibility study. And then on the negative side of stuff, where people are getting hurt or killed or lost or just generally unhappy at you, we have nonfeasance, misfeasance, and malfeasance. So this is where nonfeasance would be, you were supposed to do some hazard tree surveying around these campsites, and we can't find the work logs, and somebody just died in that big storm last night because a sickly old tree just splattered this family of 5, and the wife was pregnant, and my gosh, this is all over the news, and this was in your wheelhouse, guys. You put that campsite there, and you said it's reasonably safe for you to do this. And yeah, as park rangers, we can't make the wilds perfectly safe. We can't even make classrooms perfectly safe, right? I mean, buildings burn down, people get shot, whatever. But we do have a responsibility to do what we can do, what is reasonable to be done, and show that we have done that in things like work logs, so that when you get hauled into court before a judge and the judge says, prove to me that you have done the right thing, the right way, at the right frequency, for the right reasons for your visitors, you got to have that work log to hand over. When I was an expert witness in that court case with Cook County Forest Preserves, a fellow was hurt on their multi-use trails, not by a falling tree, but by a chain that was strung across the multi-use path. He hit it at full speed on his bicycle. And his life was forever changed, right? I mean, genuine serious brain damage going on in that particular guy. So he sued Cook County Forest Preserve saying, this is your fault, like you guys put this chain here. And they said, well, we did put the chain there, but it's not our fault. here are the work logs where we tried to surface that chain and we tried to put a warning sign on it saying, like, do not cross and stuff like that. And, you know, this is on you. Like, you didn't see the chain. It's your fault, your accident. And the truth of the fact is that they did string the chain, and at one point they did have a warning sign up, but the safety markings on that chain had faded and the sign was gone. And so there were maintenance records saying that, you know, they opened this up, or some visitor at night cut this chain, so we strung a new chain on and stuff like that. And at some point through that process, part of the safety features of that site were removed, and the lawyer for the guy who was injured was able to show that, look, in the site plan, in the blueprint for this chain gate, cable gate as it's called, there's supposed to be a safety sign hanging from the chain that is high visibility, and it's supposed to be this big, and that sign's not even there anymore. So you guys are on the hook. And they ended up settling out of court for a lot of money because the safety sign wasn't on a chain. Right? So accidents do happen, and if you are not doing what you're supposed to do, like not looking for hazard trees, not taking care of the hazard trees when you find them, that's called nonfeasance. If you are looking for hazard trees and you see a hazard tree and you fell the hazard tree while somebody's using the campsite and you fell the hazard tree out of their car, that's misfeasance. You're trying to do the right thing, but you fucked it up. And then malfeasance is where you're like the mustache twirling villain and you get your chainsaw out, and while these people are asleep in their tent at night, you chainsaw the tree down on top of them. That's malfeasance. That's kind of doing the wrong thing on purpose. So most commonly, nonfeasance is the issue when there's somebody hurt or injured or killed. Well, in a lot of cases, it's just bad luck or the visitor's fault. Like, if somebody crosses the fence line, we'll see a bunch of examples of this in the human impacts section of the class. If somebody jumps a fence or crosses a cable gate or is doing something that they know to be out beyond the wire, so to speak, that's on them, right? The Park Service has put the fence up, and they've put up signs saying, hey, this 1,000-foot cliff is dangerous. Don't go past the fence. Some people will do that anyway and die. That's on them. But for everything else, there's for everything else, it's some question of degree of feasance, or what kind of misfeasance, malfeasance, or nonfeasance has happened on the part of the park manager instead of on the part of the visitor. Because we're going in assuming that most folks going to the Grand Canyon, or to Horseshoe Bend, or to Wall Street on BLM land outside of Moab to go rock climbing or whatever, most of the people going to do that are not experts. They're not survivalists. They're not high-angle rescue certified rock climbers. They're like weekend warrior folks who are just out to go kick around Moab for a bit. And we know that going in, that the large majority is in that camp. And there's nothing wrong with that. So it's on us to try and do everything that we can to start and maintain and repair adequate safety measures for folks. So with that preamble, let's head on outside for a hazard tree monitoring exercise.